So I made a goal in 2022 to read 4 books, and I ended up reading 25 books. So I'm going to go through every book I read in 2022, and I'm going to tell you whether I think you should read it or leave it. I know we're already far into 2023, and that's why I'm doing a bonus round, okay? You'll see. Pile number 1. Oof, I just threw those onto my laptop. First book I read was A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. She's now one of my favorite authors. This was admittedly challenging. I have the next 2 books in the trilogy on my bookshelf that I haven't read yet, and it's honestly, her writing style is pretty challenging, but really just amazing, like sci-fi fantasy writer. I'm obsessed with her. Read it. The second book I read was The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I loved this book. I highly recommend it. It was really entertaining. If you're trying to get into reading, it's a really good book. Read it. Probably reread it at some point. Next, I read The Magicians by Lev Grossman. I did not like this very much. I think that some people might. However, I just found the protagonist kind of just frustrating. I think the world building is really good in this book, so read it if you want. I didn't really like the protagonist that much, which made it harder to enjoy the book. Also, there's a furry sex scene in this. 1984 by George Orwell. A classic, obviously, my first time reading this, and I would say read it. Yes, dystopic future. It kind of helps you get a lot of references. I'm glad I read this. The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. I loved this book. I read it in like 2 days. It's a really fast read. I remember when I bought this book, the girl at the bookstore was like, that's one of my favorite books. And then it became one of my favorite books just because it really resonated with me. The whole like way the world works in this just struck a chord. So I love this. It's so short too. Like it's an easy read. Next was Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. I loved this book actually. It reminded me a lot of Carl Hyacin. I will not be watching the movie because I think they did the casting weird. The 2 dudes look the same based on the trailer. I'm not going to be a fan because I love this book so much and it's not going to live up to the book. I do not want to think about Delia Owens' life, which has been it definitely came up last year. But taking the book on its own, I really enjoyed this. And I was a huge fan of Carl Hyacin when I was a kid, so that's why I would say read this. Next up was The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. This was my second book of hers that I read. For one thing, let's look at this art. Excuse me. I do judge a book by its cover, and you can see like all of these little tabs I have stuck in here. Once again, complicated writing, kind of hard to get into unless you're like invested in actually reading the book, you know what I mean? In this book, all of the inhabitants of the world that this like guy is visiting are gender fluid. I'm non-binary. I loved it. I was so happy to read this. And also like there's this quote that I think of so often. Let me see if I can find it. Happiness has to do with reason, and only reason earns it. What I was given was the thing you can't earn and can't keep and often don't even recognize at the time. I mean, joy. I think about that literally all the time. I love this book. I would say read it. The writing is kind of hard to get into. Gotta push through, but it's worth it. Also, like the plot is so crazy. Like so much happens in this book. Next, I read Mexican Gothic by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. This is one of those books that just kind of left me as soon as I finished reading it. I don't really know what to say with this one. I'm 50-50 because I didn't hate it enough for me to say like don't read this book, so I guess read it. I don't know. So after that, I reread the Divergent trilogy. I would say yeah, read that trilogy at least once. I just was kind of in a YA mood and I wanted to reread those. I read the entire first one like on the plane, like just the whole time. By the time I was done reading the trilogy though, I was like so tired, but worth reading, I would say. After that, I read The Word for World is Forest by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is a book that I think should be taught in high schools. It's supposedly kind of a book that like the idea of Avatar is sort of loosely based around, but I highly, highly recommend it because it talks about like language and culture and colonialism and the destruction of forests and all that business. It's really, really incredible book. And that one was shorter, so I think a lot more digestible than some of her other books. Yes, read it. Okay, we're on to our next pile. Next, I read Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I loved this book. This book made me want to learn how to surf. I just really like her writing. It's just so fun and like there's so many characters. I think this book made me love one of my other books I'm about to talk about even more. Yes, read it. After that, I read The Girl on the Train by Paula Hawkins. I remember I actually had to stop reading this for a while just because it was making me feel like so bad. Like just it was emotionally affecting me in a way that wasn't healthy. And then I read the second half of it, and it just like made all of it like make sense and worth it. And so I would say, yes, read this, but be careful if it's impacting your mental health. Stop, take a break, which I have done for like a couple books have made me feel that way, where like I need to stop, then I can finish it and it'll be fine. Like the payoff was great. The payoff was really good. Next was The Beautiful Ones by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. She wrote Mexican Gothic. I would say, yes, read this. If you're into like debutante ball type stuff, which I 100% am into, like reading stuff like that. I haven't read the Bridgerton books just because I've heard they're a little like sleazy sometimes, but I'm really into like the debutante stuff, just like and this one also has like a little bit of a fantasy element. I thought this was really interesting. It's in 2 parts, and I actually really enjoyed like finishing the first part and letting that settle and then going on to the second part. I like this one. I would say pick it up if you like the debutante stuff, but if you don't, it's probably not worth it. Next, oof, this was one of my favorite books. Carrie Soto is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I loved this book. Like, I think a lot of people have said that her writing in this isn't as good as her writing in her other books. This made me want to play tennis. She's really good at making you want to like do the thing in the book. So this is actually a character that was in Malibu Rising. I love this book. It was so easy to read and just like a page turner, honestly. I think the structure is a lot more simple than her other books, which is probably why people were like, it's not as complex and blah 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 blah. It was just so fun to read. It was delightful, and I will be rereading this. So yes, read this one, pick it up. Emma. It took me like 4 months to finish this book. So I've read Pride and Prejudice, but this was my second Jane Austen read. And I think it's really helpful for me, at least, to watch the movie adaptation beforehand so that I actually know what's going on. And I feel like I can get actually more invested in what's going on. If it hadn't taken me so long to get through it, I would probably be like, yes, immediately read it. But it was kind of, I don't know, challenging for me to like get through these long passages sometimes. It was a challenge, but I would say it was worth it. Next, I read A Lady's Guide to Fortune Hunting by Sophie Irwin. I really liked this book. It's funny, I've seen pictures of the other cover for this book, and it's horrendous. If I had seen the other cover version of this book, I would never have read it. But this one's kind of cute. I like it. Highly recommend this if you like the debutante stuff, because that's what it's all about. It's this girl who's like trying to find a man who's rich because like that's what she needs. I honestly like don't really remember like the middle end section of this, so maybe I'll reread this soon. I really enjoyed it though. It was just so fast to read, and I don't know, sometimes I just eat books up. This was one of them. So yes, I recommend this one. A good romance. Okay, next I read The Inheritance Games and The Hawthorne Legacy by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. Don't bother. Like, I'm sorry. I shouldn't put an age limit on this because like some older people might like this, and it's fine. These just felt so young to me. It felt like the main character's like just internal monologue was getting interrupted constantly by the thought of these boys. You can still build like romantic tension without like constantly mentioning like the character's attraction to the other characters. If you trust the reader to kind of imagine the space between. I didn't feel like I needed to read the third. You can leave those ones on the shelf. After that, I read Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo. These were some of my favorite books of the year. This is a duology. I think more authors should write duologies because it was just perfectly wrapped up in these books. For those of you who don't know, this is like a duology that exists in the same universe as the Shadow and Bone trilogy, which I haven't read. I was still able to read these, and I loved these books. They are so fun. The characters are just, you love them. There is queer representation, and adventure and heist and so much drama, and it's amazing. Somebody told me once that the Shadow and Bone trilogy like wasn't as good as these books, so I kind of like am more apprehensive about reading them, but I would say definitely read these. And I didn't find them confusing at all because I've watched the Shadow and Bone series on Netflix, so I understood like the basics of like all the magic that was happening. Like I understood that from the show, and also these characters are in that show. They blend the trilogy and this duology together in the show with the characters. You get to love these characters so much and root for them, and just, oh my god, the heartbreak, the love. It's amazing. The Angel Fall trilogy by Susan E. So that's Angel Fall, World After, and End of Days. And that was right after I gotten my Kindle. I wanted to get my Kindle for books that like I didn't really feel like I need the physical copy of. So like for me that probably would have been like, if I had a Kindle, I probably wouldn't have gotten the physical copies of like these books, for example. So I like having the Kindle for books that I'm like, I probably am not really gonna like want to have a physical copy of these books. Yeah, it's been great for that. But onto Angel Fall. This isn't a video about my Kindle. It's a paperwhite. I love it because I can read in the dark while my boyfriend's sleeping. It's great. Back to the point of the video. This was a YA trilogy and I hadn't really heard of it before I found it just like on like the Kindle store. And I really enjoyed the trilogy. I thought like, you know, the storyline was pretty interesting. It definitely has like a relationship between a 17-year-old and this being who is supposedly like so old but in like, you know, a hot young body or something. That cognitive dissonance where I just have to be like, no, I'm just gonna pretend that's not a factor. It was just like fantasy about like angels coming to earth, but like then they're kind of like maybe evil and there's like an apocalypse happening basically. Pretty interesting. And I think if you like want to read a fantasy YA book, it could be good. I wouldn't say it's like an immediate yes, you have to read this, you know. I would say like it was decent enough and I enjoyed it. So I can't really just say like leave it behind entirely. It probably will feel too young for you if you're like my age, but if you're like in early high school or something, it's probably great. It's probably really good if you're in early high school. Bonus round of all the books that I have read thus far in 2023. I have read 5. The first one was I Was Born for This by Alice Oseman. I really wanted to like this book. I know a lot of people like the Heartbreaker? Is that what it's called? I'll have to figure that out. So I really wanted to like this and I just didn't really like it that much. It did give me kind of an insight on like, you know, like what fandom is really like for someone who's involved in that, because I've never really been part of like an intense fandom. So I found that actually really insightful and that kind of like added something for me. Me personally, I wouldn't read this again. I would say just leave it. Next, I read Dealing with Dragons by Patricia C. Reed. This is a YA book from like the 90s or something, the 80s or the 90s. I think it's published in 1990. This was amazing. Read this. The writing is just incredible. It like reminded me like, because I was going back and forth between this and I Was Born for This when I was reading that. And just the contrast in how well they're written is insane. Like this is so well written and yet a young reader could read this. I'm sorry, when I'm talking about something being well written, I'm actually most of the time I'm just talking about the writing style. I think I just liked the writing style of the older book more. It just felt a little more poetic. I Was Born for This literally felt like I was reading fan fiction, which is like half the point maybe, but I did not like it. Basically a princess doesn't want to marry the like complete doofus prince and the next door kingdom, so she runs away to work for a dragon. And there's like a whole bunch of like fairy tale lore that's just like so funny. It is so humorous and just intelligent. I highly recommend it. It just filled my heart up. And then I also just finished Once Upon a Broken Heart and the Ballad of Never After by Stephanie Garber. These are I thought they were going to be a duology, which is why I started reading it. It's a trilogy. The next one doesn't come out till September, which is frustrating for me. This is in the Caraval universe. I actually haven't read those books. I like it when a writer already has the kinks worked out. These books felt a little adolescent to me. I read them because a YouTuber recommended them and really loved them, so I was like, okay, maybe I'll really like it too. But I should know better because she also really loved these and I did not like these. But, you know, we can't all be the exact same person. By the end of the second book, I was actually really invested in the characters. Like I would say I got into it in the second book. There's just a lot of stuff to do with like kissing. And we're not even like, kissing isn't happening, but we're just thinking about kissing. And it's just a little, like I was judging myself for reading a book that was like that. I would say if you're 15 and under, you'll love it. Mixed feelings, maybe leave it. My most recent book was I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. This is the first memoir I've read in several years. This was incredible. Like I know this book is being talked about a lot, and trust me, if you only read novels, you can read this. You will be able to read this. I got through this book in like 3 days or something, 3 or 4 days. I was honestly stretching it out a bit because I loved it so much. She is just an incredible writer. Like I cannot wait to read whatever she cooks up next. Like, I know she has like a book deal and I really want to read whatever she writes. Her writing was just so good. Yes, I highly recommend this. I was reading it and there were so many places that I wanted to like bookmark, but I'm borrowing this book, so I can't do that. So I'm going to buy a copy of this book so that I can put sticky notes in it. I'm serious. Please leave me a comment down below of a book recommendation that you think I would like, or a book recommendation that you love. I'm also interested, if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them, if you had similar or different feelings from me, because like I enjoy the fact that like people can feel differently about the same book, like in intense ways. I love talking about books because whenever I'm talking in real life to someone about a book, I feel like I'm just like seizing the conversation. So this is really like scratching an itch for me. Hope you all have a wonderful day. Subscribe if you want to see more from me, and I will see you in the next one.